The 1%, Part 6. The former elite without monopoly. MXDM, aka Pirate 1, or VJ, Tsunami X. April 9th, 2026. Part 6. The social inversion. 26. The former elite without monopoly. Power, in every civilization that has preceded this one, has rested on at least one monopoly. Not always the same monopoly. The specific form of exclusive control that organized hierarchy has varied across civilizations and across the eras within each civilization. The monopoly on divine interpretation that the priestly class maintained in the theocratic city. The monopoly on military force that the warrior aristocracy maintained in the feudal order. The monopoly on capital accumulation that the merchant class maintained in the early market economy. The monopoly on industrial capacity that the factory owner maintained in the first century of mass production. The monopoly on cognitive capacity, the specific credentialed, institutionally certified form of cognitive capacity that the previous chapters have described, that the professional and managerial class maintained in the post-industrial economy of the past half-century. Each of these monopolies was real, not constructed by ideology alone, though ideology sustained and legitimized each of them, but grounded in a genuine scarcity that the monopoly captured and protected. The priest had access to the sacred texts that others could not read. The warrior had access to the weapons and the training that others could not afford. The merchant had access to the capital and the trade networks that others could not enter. The factory owner had access to the machinery and the organizational capacity that others could not assemble. The professional had access to the analytical tools, the knowledge bases, the institutional credentials that others could not acquire without years of expensive credential training. The monopoly was the foundation. The power was the structure built on it. When the monopoly dissolved, when the sacred text became available in the vernacular, when the weapons became available to the peasant army, when the capital markets became accessible to the joint stock company, when the factory model became replicable by new entrants, the structure built on it required reconstruction. Not always immediately. The structure persisted, often for generations after the monopoly that founded it had dissolved, sustained by the institutional inertia that all structures develop and by the ideological defenses that the beneficiaries of the structure deployed against the recognition that its foundation had gone. But eventually the reconstruction came. The theocracy became the state. The feudal aristocracy became the landed gentry. The merchant class became the industrial capitalist. The factory owner became the shareholder. Each transformation preserved some of the power of the preceding structure while reorganizing it around the new monopoly that the next phase of the economy produced. The cognitive monopoly that the professional and managerial class maintained is dissolving. This chapter is about what happens to the class that held it, not what happens to the class economically. The economic consequences of cognitive equalization for the professional and managerial class are described in Part 1. Not what happens to the class institutionally. The institutional consequences are described in the legitimacy crisis chapter. What happens to the class as a social formation, as the specific group of people who organize their identities, their relationships, their self-understanding, and their claims on the world around the cognitive monopoly that AI is dissolving. The former elite without monopoly is a historically recurring figure. Every dissolution of a founding monopoly produces one, and the historical record of how that figure navigates the dissolution, how the class that held the monopoly responds to its dissolution, what strategies it deploys, what pathologies it develops, what contributions it eventually makes to the civilization that succeeds the one it organized, is the record that the 1% doctrine draws on in designing the transition campus's relationship to the population that, alongside the displaced workers, arrives in the condition of the dissolution. Because the former elite arrives too, not always recognizing itself as such, not always using the vocabulary of elite status to describe the condition it is in, more often arriving in the vocabulary of disruption. The senior manager whose role has been eliminated by organizational restructuring in response to AI capability. The consultant whose practice has been hollowed out by the tools that her clients now deploy without her intermediation. The academic whose expertise has been partially superseded by the AI systems that perform its most teachable components without the institutional overhead that the university requires. These are not people who think of themselves as elites in the pejorative sense. They are people who built their lives around the cognitive monopoly and who are now discovering, in the specific daily experiences of professional life and the transition, that the monopoly is dissolving beneath their feet. The former elite without monopoly faces a specific set of challenges that are distinct from the challenges of the displaced worker, and the transition campus must be designed to receive both populations without pretending that their challenges are identical. The displaced worker's primary challenge is the replacement of the employment that organized her life with a form of purposeful activity that the employment no longer provides. She is moving from the certainty of the assigned function to the uncertainty of the chosen participation, and the transition campus is designed to receive her in that movement, to provide the community and the governance and the surface and the time that the genuinely chosen participation requires to develop. The former elite's primary challenge is different in character, if not an ultimate destination. It is a replacement of the certainty of cognitive superiority with the uncertainty of cognitive parity. The movement from a world in which the differential between her analytical capacity and the analytical capacity of the people she managed or advised or taught or treated was the justification for her position, to a world in which that differential has compressed to the point where it can no longer carry the weight she has placed on it. This is a more specifically psychological challenge than the displaced workers, and it is in some ways harder to address, because the former elite's relationship to her cognitive capacity is not merely instrumental. It is identity constitutive in a specific and deep way. The person who has spent 20 years in a cognitive elite role has not merely used her cognitive capacity as a tool for performing a function. She has built her self-understanding around the conviction that her cognitive capacity is genuinely superior, that she is, in the specific sense that her professional formation has equipped her to value, smarter than the people she manages, more analytical than the clients she advises, more expert than the students she teaches, more capable than the patients she treats. This conviction is not entirely false. The cognitive differential that the former elite developed through her specific training and experience was genuine, the product of real investment in real competence development, not the mere performance of superiority that ideology alone produces. The management consultant who spent 20 years developing her capacity for organizational analysis genuinely can analyze organizations with a depth and speed and comprehensiveness that most people who have not spent 20 years doing organizational analysis cannot match. What is happening is not the revelation that the conviction was always false. It is the dissolution of the scarcity that made the genuine differential matter in the way that it did. The management consultant's organizational analysis was valuable in the specific conditions of a world in which organizational analysis was scarce, in which the clients who needed it could not produce it themselves and had to purchase it from the people who could. When the AI tools that make sophisticated organizational analysis available to anyone dissolve the scarcity of that capacity, the genuine differential that the management consultant possesses does not disappear. It becomes, in the economic and social sense, less significant, not because it is less real, but because the gap between her capacity and the capacity of the person who is deploying AI-assisted analysis has compressed to the point where the economic and social premium it commands is no longer proportional to the investment required to produce it. The former elite without monopoly is therefore in the specific position of possessing genuine competence in conditions where genuine competence is no longer scarce enough to command the premium that her formation assumed it would command. Her competence is real. Its scarcity is dissolving. The price the world was willing to pay for it is declining. And the identity that was built on the premium, the self-understanding that was organized around the conviction that her specific cognitive capacity was sufficiently rare and sufficiently valuable to justify the position she held in the social hierarchy, requires reconstruction. This reconstruction is the specific form of transition that the former elite faces, and it is the transition for which the campus must be designed to provide the conditions. The campus is not, and this must be stated directly, designed to restore the former elite's premium. The premium was the product of the scarcity that is dissolving, and the campus is not in the business of restoring scarcity. The former elite who arrives at the campus expecting it to provide the conditions for the restoration of her cognitive monopoly. The selective community of people with comparable credentials, the validation of the hierarchy of competence that the professional world maintained, the confirmation that her specific cognitive capacity is still the primary measure of human value, will be disappointed. Not because the campus is hostile to her competence, which it genuinely needs and genuinely values, but because the campus is organized around a different principle than the one her monopoly required. The campus is organized around cognitive parity, the recognition that the AI tools that have dissolved the cognitive monopoly have made the full range of the campus's population capable of sophisticated analysis and planning and argumentation, and that the governance of the campus's collective life must be designed for this condition rather than for the condition of cognitive hierarchy that the former elite's formation assumed. This is the specific social challenge that the transition campus faces, the integration of a population that includes both the displaced worker, who arrives from below the cognitive hierarchy and is discovering the capacities that the hierarchy denied her, and the former elite, who arrives from above the cognitive hierarchy and is discovering the conditions in which those capacities are no longer sufficient to maintain the premium that the hierarchy provided. The social dynamics of this integration are not automatically positive. The displaced worker who has spent 20 years being managed by the former elite, being told, explicitly or implicitly, that her judgment was less valuable and her perspective less relevant, and her contribution less central to the organization's function than the judgment and perspective and contribution of the people above her in the hierarchy, does not automatically extend trust and respect to the former elite who arrives at the campus in the condition of the dissolution. She may experience the former elite's presence in the campus's community as the continuation, in a new institutional form, of the hierarchical relationship that the campus was designed to succeed. The former elite who has spent 20 years in the condition of cognitive superiority, who has developed the habits of authority and the expectations of deference that the cognitive hierarchy produced, does not automatically relinquish those habits and expectations when she arrives at the campus in the condition of the dissolution. She may experience the campus's commitment to cognitive parity as the denial of the genuine competence she possesses, and resist it in the ways that people who believe their genuine competence is being denied tend to resist, through the assertion of expertise, the deployment of institutional vocabulary, the subtle social moves that reproduce the hierarchy's dynamics in environments that are formally committed to their dissolution. These dynamics are real, and the campus's design must account for them, not by pretending they will not occur, which would be the naivete that produces the failure mode, but by building into the campus's social architecture and governance mechanisms the specific provisions that prevent the dynamics from reproducing the hierarchy that the campus is designed to succeed. The provisions are not primarily structural. They are cultural, the specific norms and practices and social expectations that the campus's community develops through its collective life and enforces through the social accountability that community produces. The first cultural provision is the norm of competence contribution over competence display. The cognitive hierarchy's social culture rewarded the display of competence, the performance of expertise in the specific registers that the professional world recognized as authoritative, the deployment of the vocabulary and the analytical frameworks and the institutional affiliations that signaled membership in the cognitive elite. The display was the social currency of the hierarchy. The person who displayed most effectively commanded the most deference, accessed the most resources, shaped the most decisions. The campus's culture replaces the norm of display with the norm of contribution. The expectation that competence is demonstrated through its application to the campus's genuine collective needs rather than through its performance in the social registers that the professional world recognized. The former elite who contributes her organizational analysis to the dream validation process's governance development, who applies her 20 years of analytical capacity to the specific challenges of making the campus's collective decision-making more effective, is contributing in the campus's terms. The former elite who displays her organizational analysis by correcting the governance proposals of community members with less credentialed backgrounds, who performs her expertise in the social register of the hierarchy, is displaying in the hierarchy's terms. The campus's social culture makes the distinction legible and consequential, not through formal sanction, but through the daily social feedback that community life provides. The contribution is recognized, and the recognition accumulates into the post-professional identity and the stewardship role and the community respect that the campus's social economy produces. The display is not recognized in the same way. It is received with the specific form of social neutrality that community cultures develop for performances that the community's values do not endorse. The second cultural provision is the norm of genuine curiosity over claimed mastery. The cognitive elite's relationship to knowledge was organized around the claim of mastery. The credential that certified the claim, the performance that demonstrated it, the social expectation that the expert knows and the non-expert learns from a knowing. This relationship to knowledge produces a specific epistemological posture. The posture of the person who has mastered the domain and whose primary cognitive activity in the domain is the application of established knowledge rather than the genuine inquiry into what is not yet known. The campus's cognitive culture is organized around genuine curiosity, the recognition that the specific domain of knowledge that the transition campus is developing, the domain of post-war governance and meaning infrastructure and cognitive equalization in practice, is a domain in which nobody has established mastery because the domain is new. The former elite's 20 years of organizational analysis provides genuine resources for the campus's governance challenges. It does not provide mastery of those challenges. Because those challenges are genuinely novel, and the established knowledge that the former elite's formation equipped her with must be applied with the specific epistemic humility of someone who knows that her knowledge was developed for conditions that are changing and that its application to the new conditions requires genuine inquiry rather than the confident deployment of established frameworks. The genuine curiosity norm benefits both the former elite and the campus's collective intelligence. The former elite who approaches the campus's governance challenges with genuine curiosity, who is willing to discover that her 20 years of organizational analysis does not straightforwardly map onto the specific governance challenges of the dream validation process, who is willing to learn from the taxi driver whose 20 years of navigating human behavior in the passenger compartment has produced insights that the organizational analysis framework did not develop, is a former elite, whose competence is genuinely expanded by the campus's cross-competence environment. The former elite who approaches the campus's governance challenges with the confidence of established mastery, who maps the dream validation process onto the organizational frameworks she knows and adapts it to those frameworks rather than adapting her frameworks to its genuine novelty, is a former elite whose competence is applied but not expanded. The third cultural provision is the norm of narrative accountability. The cognitive hierarchy maintained its social legitimacy, in part through the control of narrative, the ability to tell the story of the organization, the field, the project, in ways that confirmed the hierarchy's account of who had contributed what and why the outcomes were what they were. The manager's narrative of the team's success emphasized the manager's strategic direction. The consultant's narrative of the engagement emphasized the consultant's analytical insight. The academic's narrative of the research emphasized the academic's theoretical framework. The narrative was not always false. The manager did provide strategic direction. The consultant did provide analytical insight. The academic did provide theoretical framework. But the narrative systematically underemphasized the contributions of the people further down the hierarchy whose execution and local knowledge and practical insight made the strategic direction executable, the analytical insight applicable, the theoretical framework empirically grounded. The campus's norm of narrative accountability requires the former elite to account, in the campus's social culture, for the contributions that the hierarchy's narrative systematically obscured, not as a ritual of self-flagellation, not as the performance of guilt for the hierarchy's narrative distortions, but as the genuine intellectual practice of tracing the genealogy of insights and decisions to their actual sources, which in the specific social environment of the campus will frequently reveal that the sources include people whose contributions the hierarchy's narrative would not have recognized. This is a more demanding norm for the former elite than for the displaced worker, because it requires the former elite to actively revise the narrative of her own competence, to locate her analytical capacity in the social and collaborative processes that produced it rather than treating it as the individual possession that the professional formation encouraged her to treat it as. The former elite who can do this, who can say, genuinely and without performance, that the insight she is contributing to the campus's governance came from the conversation with the taxi driver who knew the city in the way that 20 years of organizational analysis had not equipped her know it, is the former elite who is genuinely navigating the dissolution of the monopoly rather than reproducing its social dynamics in a new institutional form. The fourth cultural provision is the norm of institutional learning over institutional authority. The cognitive elite's authority in the professional world derived, in part, from institutional affiliations that her formation produced, the university that credentialed her, the firm that employed her, the professional body that certified her, the publications that validated her. These institutional affiliations were sources of authority, not personal authority, which she might or might not have possessed, but positional authority, the authority that derived from the institutional position rather than from the demonstrated quality of the specific contribution. The campus has no mechanism for recognizing institutional authority in this sense. The dream validation process does not weight the contributions of former McKinsey consultants more heavily than the contributions of former taxi drivers. The campus's social culture does not extend deference to the institutional affiliations of the people who arrive, not because those affiliations are irrelevant to the competences they represent, but because the campus's governance is designed to assess competence through its demonstrated contribution rather than through the institutional position from which it was previously exercised. This is experienced by the former elite as the loss of a resource. The positional authority that the institutional affiliation provided is genuinely valuable in the professional world, and its unavailability in the campus's social economy is a genuine reduction in the social resources that the former elite can deploy. The campus's norm of institutional learning, the expectation that what the former elite brings from her institutional affiliations is the knowledge and experience and analytical capacity that those affiliations helped her develop, rather than the authority that those affiliations conferred, reframes the former elite's institutional background as a resource for learning rather than a basis for authority. The reframe is not a demotion. It is the specific form of integration that the campus's cognitive parity requires. The former elite's institutional competence is valued for what it enables, for the analytical capacity, the domain knowledge, the governance experience that it represents, not for what it confers, the positional authority that the institution's social recognition provides. The campus values the competence. It does not recognize the authority. And in the campus's social economy, as in every social economy organized around genuine contribution rather than positional hierarchy, that distinction determines the character of the community that results. Together, these four cultural provisions, competence contribution over display, genuine curiosity over claimed mastery, narrative accountability, institutional learning over institutional authority, constitute the campus's specific response to the challenge of integrating the former elite without monopoly into a community that is organized around the cognitive parity that the dissolution of the monopoly produces. They do not resolve the challenge. Social dynamics of the kind that the integration of former elites and displaced workers in conditions of cognitive equalization produces are not resolved by cultural provisions. They are managed continuously, imperfectly, with the ongoing attention and the ongoing adjustment that every genuine community gives to the dynamics that its specific membership generates. But they provide the cultural framework within which the management can occur, the shared understanding of what the campus's community is organized around, and what forms of social behavior endorses, and what forms it receives with the specific neutrality that community cultures develop for the performances they do not recognize. The former elite, without monopoly, is not the campus's primary population. The campus is designed primarily for the displaced worker, for the person who was below the cognitive hierarchy and is now discovering the capacities that the hierarchy denied her. But the former elite is present in the campus, and her presence is not a complication to be managed or a problem to be solved. It is a resource, the specific form of competence and experience and analytical capacity that her formation produced, available to the campus's collective intelligence when it is contributed rather than displayed, when it is exercised with genuine curiosity rather than claimed mastery, when it is offered with narrative accountability rather than narrative control, when it is grounded in institutional learning rather than institutional authority. The former elite who navigates the dissolution of her monopoly in these terms, who arrives at the campus in the condition of the dissolution and develops, through her participation in the campus's collective life, the post-professional identity that the campus provides the conditions for, is the former elite who makes the most valuable contribution to the transition civilization that the campus is building. Not because she has abandoned her competence, because she has finally placed it in genuine service of a collective project that is larger than the monopoly that organized it. The monopoly is over. The competence remains. The campus is where the competence finds its post-monopoly purpose. And the former elite who finds it there, who discovers in the specific social environment of the campus's cognitive parity what her genuine competence can do when it is not organized around the protection and demonstration of the scarcity that is no longer there to be protected and demonstrated, is not diminished by the dissolution. She is, in the specific sense that the transition civilization requires, liberated by it. The monopoly was a cage as well as a throne. The dissolution opens both. The campus is where the opening is inhabitable. 27. The former worker with intelligence. There's a scene that is playing out right now in offices and meeting rooms and planning sessions across every advanced economy that the institutional vocabulary of the transition does not yet have adequate language to describe. A person who 6 months ago was not in the room, who would not have been invited to the room, whose presence in the room would not have been considered, whose perspective on the matters being discussed in a room would not have been solicited or expected or received as relevant, is in the room. Not because the invitation policies have changed, not because the diversity initiatives of the institution have finally produced the representation that they were designed to produce, but because she arrived at the meeting with an analysis, a genuinely sophisticated, comprehensively researched, clearly argued analysis of the matter under discussion, that the institution could not dismiss, because the analysis was better than the analysis produced by the people who were always in the room. She produced it with AI assistance. The institution does not know how to process this. The analysis is better than what the room has historically produced, which means the institution's commitment to making good decisions on the basis of good analysis requires it to take the analysis seriously. But the analysis was produced by someone who was not supposed to be able to produce it, who lacks the credentials that the institution uses to certify analytical capacity, who comes from a background that the institution's social culture has not prepared it to recognize as a source of authoritative analysis, who is in the room on the strength of a contribution that the institution's own analytical standards cannot dismiss, but that its social standards have not developed the capacity to receive. The discomfort in the room is the sound of the cognitive hierarchy meeting its dissolution in real time. The person who produced the analysis is the former worker with intelligence. Not former in the sense of no longer a worker. She may still be employed, may still occupy the role that the institution assigned to her before the AI tools made her capable of the analysis that the institution did not expect from her. Former in the specific sense that the chapter title intends. Former as in previously defined by the cognitive hierarchy's account of her capacity, formerly understood as the executor rather than the analyst, formerly positioned below the line that the cognitive hierarchy drew between the people who plan and the people who carry out the plan. She has crossed the line, not by acquiring the credentials that the hierarchy required for crossing, not by ascending the institutional ladder that the hierarchy maintained between execution and planning, by acquiring, through the AI tools that the cognitive equalization has made available, the analytical capacity that the hierarchy's line was designed to gate. The line was the monopoly. The monopoly is dissolving. She is through. This crossing is the most historically significant social event of the current transition, more significant, in the long run, than the displacement of the professional and managerial class, whose dissolution is more visible and more discussed, but whose consequences are, in the deepest sense, less transformative. The dissolution of the former elite's monopoly is the dissolution of a structure that was always somewhat arbitrary in its specific form, that rested on a scarcity that was always contingent on the specific information environment that produced it, and whose dissolution was always the predictable consequence of sufficient democratization of the tools that the scarcity was organized around. The crossing of the former worker is different in character. It is not the dissolution of a structure that was contingent. It is the dissolution of a structure that was taken by the civilization that produced it to be natural, the expression of genuine and inherent differences in human cognitive capacity rather than the product of differential access to the tools and training and institutional support that cognitive capacity requires. The hierarchy told itself that the people above the line were above it because they were genuinely more capable than the people below it, not because they had been given more of the resources that cognitive capacity requires to develop, but because they were inherently the kind of people whose capacity justified the resources they received. This story was always false. The cognitive capacity that the hierarchy gated was not inherent. It was developed through specific investments in specific training with specific tools in specific institutional contexts, and the differential access to those investments, that training, those tools, and those institutional contexts was the product of the hierarchy's own operation rather than the evidence for its justification. The hierarchy maintained itself by restricting access to the developmental resources that would have dissolved it, and then cited the resulting differential as the evidence that the restriction was justified. The AI tools are dissolving this justification at the root, not by revealing that the hierarchy's story was always false. The history of political and social criticism has been revealing this for centuries, without dissolving the hierarchy, because revelation without the material means of alternatives is insufficient to change the conditions it reveals. But by providing to the people below the line the material means, the actual analytical tools, the actual access to information, the actual capacity for the sophisticated analysis and planning and argumentation that the hierarchy maintained was accessible only through the credential pathway it controlled, that make the story's falseness consequential rather than merely theoretical. The former worker with intelligence is the material consequence of the story's falseness becoming consequential. She is the demonstration, in the specific person and the specific analysis and the specific room in which the analysis was received, that the cognitive differential the hierarchy maintained was not the expression of inherent human differences, but the product of differential resource access, and that the dissolution of the resource scarcity dissolves the differential. The transition campus receives this person in the specific condition of having crossed the line. She arrives at the campus not in the condition of the pure displacement that the preceding chapters have described, not in the condition of having lost the employment that organized her life and requiring the campus to provide the conditions in which post-professional identity can be constructed. She may still be employed. She may still be in the room, navigating the specific discomfort of the institution that does not know how to receive her analysis while its own analytical standards require it to take it seriously. but she arrives with a specific need that the campus is designed to meet: the need for the social and intellectual community that can receive, develop, and extend the analytical capacity she has discovered in herself, that can provide the context in which the intelligence that the AI tools have made available to her is not merely a tool she deploys in the service of the institution's decisions, but a genuine dimension of her own cognitive development, her own growing understanding of the world, and her own growing capacity to shape it. The institution in which she works does not provide this community. The institution is designed to use her analysis when the analysis is better than what the room was producing, but is not designed to develop her analytical capacity, to take seriously her perspective on the strategic questions that the institution is designed to reserve for the people above the line. To receive her as a genuine intellectual participant in the collective intelligence of the organization, rather than as a useful contributor of specific analytical outputs when those outputs happen to exceed the institution's internal analytical capacity. The campus provides this community, not because the campus has designed a special program for the former worker with intelligence. The campus does not have special programs for special populations. The campus provides it because the campus's cognitive parity environment, its genuine curiosity norm, its dream validation process that weights contributions by their quality rather than their source, and its community of people from across the full range of former occupational backgrounds create the specific social and intellectual conditions in which the intelligence that the AI tools have revealed is received as the beginning of a genuine development rather than as a useful anomaly in the institutional machinery. What the former worker with intelligence develops at the campus is not more sophisticated AI use. The AI tools are available to her regardless of the campus's presence, and the campus does not primarily function as a training facility for AI tool deployment. What she develops is the intellectual identity that the cognitive hierarchy denied her, the self-understanding of a person whose genuine intellectual capacity is real and valuable and deserving of the institutional conditions that allow it to develop, not on the sufferance of the hierarchy that happens to find her analysis useful, but on the foundation of the cognitive parity that the transition has made available to everyone. This development of intellectual identity is one of the most important things the transition campus produces. More important than the governance innovations, more important than the transition campus model, more important than the contribution to the post-scarcity civilization's spatial and economic infrastructure. Because the former worker with intelligence who develops a genuine intellectual identity, who arrives at the self-understanding that her analytical capacity is real and that it deserves the institutional conditions for full development, is a person who will not return to the condition of the hierarchy's account of her. She will demand, in every institutional context she inhabits after the campus, the cognitive parity that the campus made available. And the accumulation of those demands across the full population of former workers with intelligence who are currently discovering, in offices and meeting rooms and planning sessions across every advanced economy, that the cognitive hierarchy's account of their capacity was false. That accumulation is the social force that will eventually reconstruct the institutional landscape of the transition civilization around the cognitive parity that the AI tools have made possible. The campus is not the only site of this development. The crossing is happening everywhere that the AI tools are available and the former worker is willing to use them. But the campus is the site where the development is most deliberately supported, where the crossing is received as the beginning of a genuine trajectory rather than as an anomaly in an institutional context that is not designed to receive it, where the intellectual identity that the crossing initiates is developed through the sustained engagement with a community of people whose analytical capacity, across the full range of their former occupational backgrounds, is being simultaneously developed through the same crossing. The specific form of the former worker's intellectual development at the campus passes through several recognizable stages that the campus's design must support. The first stage is the discovery of genuine analytical capacity. The discovery is frequently experienced as surprise, Not the surprise of the person who had no prior intimation of the capacity, but the surprise of the person who suspected the capacity but had no institutional context in which to test it. The former worker who arrives at the campus with the vague sense that she could have done more, understood more, contributed more to the decisions of the organizations she worked in if she had been given the tools and the access and the institutional recognition that the people above the line were given. That person discovers at the campus that the vague sense was accurate, that the analytical capacity she suspected in herself is real, that the AI tools make it available in a form that the campus's intellectual community can engage with, develop, and take seriously. The discovery is sometimes dramatic. The analysis that the dream validation process receives as the most penetrating contribution to a governance challenge that the campus has been wrestling with, produced by a former call center representative whose 20 years of navigating the human dimensions of institutional dysfunction equipped her with the specific insight that the former McKinsey consultants in the room had not developed. Sometimes it is quiet, the growing recognition, across weeks of participation in the campus's collective intellectual life, that the contributions she is making are being received as genuine contributions rather than as the grateful acknowledgement of the institution that found her analysis unexpectedly useful. In either form, it is consequential, the beginning of the intellectual identity that the campus is designed to develop. The campus supports the discovery stage by creating the specific conditions in which genuine analytical capacity becomes visible regardless of the credential or the institutional affiliation or the social register that the professional world uses to signal its presence. The dream validation process's norm of competence contribution over display, described in the previous chapter in the context of the former elite, serves the former worker's discovery equally by creating the conditions in which the quality of the analytical contribution is what is recognized rather than the social performance of analytical authority that the hierarchy rewarded. The second stage is the development of analytical confidence. Discovery without confidence produces the specific failure mode of the imposter. The person who has discovered her analytical capacity but cannot trust it, who produces genuine insights and immediately discounts them, who contributes penetrating analysis and immediately apologizes for it, who is always waiting for the institutional authority that will confirm that the capacity she has discovered is real rather than the accidental output of tools whose sophistication exceeds her own. The development of analytical confidence is the campus's specific social contribution to the former worker's intellectual development. Confidence is not produced by instruction. No curriculum produces genuine confidence, because confidence is the product of sustained experience of one's contributions being received as valuable by a community whose judgment one respects. The campus provides this experience. The community of people whose analytical capacity spans the full range of former occupational backgrounds, whose dream validation process produces genuine collective intelligence from the full range of contributions, and whose social culture, the genuine curiosity norm, the narrative accountability norm, creates the conditions in which the quality of the contribution rather than the credential of the contributor is what is recognized. The former worker who participates in this community across months of sustained engagement develops confidence in the specific way that sustained recognition by a respected community produces it, not the performed confidence of the professional whose institutional position requires the performance of authority, but the genuine confidence of the person who has been told, repeatedly and consistently, by the quality of the community's engagement with her contributions, that the contributions are real and that the capacity that produces them is real, and that the institutional account of her capacity, the account that said she was below the line because she lacked the specific credentials the line required, was wrong. This confidence is the intellectual inheritance of the campus's community, the specific form of social capital that the campus's cognitive parity environment produces and that the former worker carries with her when she leaves the campus and returns to the institutional landscape of the surrounding economy. It is not a credential. It is not a certification. It is the specific quality of self-knowledge that sustained recognition by a genuine intellectual community produces, The knowledge that one's analytical capacity is real, that it has been tested in genuine collective intellectual engagement, and that its value does not depend on the institutional authority that previously failed to recognize it. The third stage is the development of intellectual range. The former worker's analytical capacity, in its initial expression, is organized around the specific domain of her 20 years of working experience. The specific knowledge of how the industry she worked in actually functions, the specific insight into the human dimensions of the institutional dynamics she navigated, the specific understanding of the gap between the institution's official account of its own operations and the actual operations that the people inside it know. This domain expertise is genuine and valuable. It is in the specific conditions of the campus's intellectual community, frequently more useful than the generalist analytical frameworks that the former elite's training produced, because it is grounded in the actual texture of the actual world rather than in the abstractions that the analytical frameworks use to model it. But it is not the full range of analytical capacity that the campus's intellectual community can develop. The former worker's engagement with the dream validation process, with the full range of the campus's collective governance challenges, from the spatial design of the common spaces to the economic architecture of the embedded economy to the governance innovation of the AI amplification systems, exposes her analytical capacity to domains that her working life did not develop. She brings her domain expertise to these challenges and discovers, in the encounter with domains she has not previously engaged, that her capacity for analysis is transferable, that the specific analytical habits she developed in 20 years of navigating her industry's particular challenges are applicable with the AI tools that provide the domain knowledge she lacks, to the full range of the campus's governance challenges. This discovery of analytical range, the recognition that the capacity for analysis is not domain-specific, but can be brought, with appropriate domain support, to the full range of intellectual challenges the campus presents, is the development of the intellectual identity that the campus is designed to produce. The person who arrives with domain expertise and discovers analytical range is the person who leaves the campus with the full intellectual identity, the self-understanding of someone whose capacity for genuine intellectual engagement with the world is not confined to the specific domain that her working life organized around. The fourth stage is the development of intellectual agency. Analytical capacity, without agency, produces the specific failure mode of the advisor. The person who can analyze any situation with penetrating insight, but who cannot act on the analysis, who is permanently in the position of providing the inputs to decisions that others make, who understands more than the decision makers, but remains in the position of the person whose understanding informs rather than determines the outcome. The cognitive hierarchy maintained the former worker in the position of the advisor at best and the executor at worst. The person whose contribution to the institution's collective intelligence was the provision of specific outputs rather than the shaping of the directions those outputs were deployed toward. The campus develops intellectual agency by placing the former worker in the position of the decision maker, through the dream validation process, through the stewardship roles that the campus's governance produces, through the governance innovations that the campus's community generates, and that the former worker contributes to developing and implementing. The intellectual agency that the campus develops is not the authority of the institutional position, not the authority of the manager who has been given the power to make decisions by virtue of the institutional role she occupies. It is the authority of the genuine intellectual contribution, the authority that accumulates in the campus's cognitive parity environment through the quality of the analysis and the quality of the judgment and the quality of the stewardship that the former worker brings to the campus's collective governance. This authority is harder to accumulate than the positional authority that the institutional role confers. It requires sustained demonstration rather than conferred recognition. But it is more durable, not dependent on the continuation of the institutional position that could be eliminated by the next reorganization, but grounded in the ongoing quality of the contribution that the community has learned through sustained engagement to recognize and rely on. The former worker who develops intellectual agency at the campus, who moves from the discovery of analytical capacity through the development of confidence and range to the exercise of genuine intellectual authority in the governance of a collective project that matters, is the former worker who has made the crossing complete. She has not merely acquired the tools that made the crossing possible. She has developed, through the sustained exercise of those tools in the service of genuine collective intelligence, the full intellectual identity that the crossing initiates. She is no longer the former worker. She is the intellectual participant in the governance of the transition. Not despite her working background. Because of it, because the 20 years of navigating the actual operations of the actual world that her working life produced is the specific experiential foundation on which her analytical capacity has been built, and the specific ground from which her intellectual contributions to the campus's governance derive their distinctive character and their distinctive value. The cognitive hierarchy said she was below the line because she lacked the credentials. The campus says she is at the table because she brings the analysis. These are not the same statement. The difference between them is the difference between the civilization that is ending and the civilization that is beginning. The former worker with intelligence is not the incidental beneficiary of the transition's technological development. She is its primary social expression, the specific human form that the cognitive equalization takes when it is received in the specific social conditions of a community designed to receive it. Every advanced economy is currently producing her in the offices and meeting rooms and planning sessions where the AI tools are making the analysis available and the institution is not yet sure how to receive it. The campus is the first institution that knows what to receive. That is why she comes. That is what she finds. That is what she carries back. The intelligence was always there. The tools made it visible. The campus made it real. 28. The bourgeoisie in transition. The bourgeoisie has always been the most interesting class. Not the most powerful. Power, in its naked form, has historically resided elsewhere. In the aristocracy that commanded the armies, the clergy that commanded the conscience, the industrial magnate that commanded the capital at its most concentrated. Not the most sympathetic. Sympathy, in the moral accounting of political tradition, has more readily attached to the laboring class whose exploitation the bourgeoisie organized and whose surplus it appropriated. Not the most coherent. The bourgeoisie's internal divisions, its fractured relationship to the classes above and below it, its chronic anxiety about its own position in the social hierarchy, have made it the least internally unified of the major class formations that industrial civilization produced. But the most interesting, because the bourgeoisie is the class of the middle. Not the middle in the statistical sense of median income, but the middle in the structural sense of the class that mediates between the apex and the base, that translates the power of the top into the operations of the bottom, that sustains itself through the specific combination of proximity to power and distance from labor that the middle position requires. And the class of the middle is always the class most acutely exposed to the contradictions of the social order it inhabits, most aware of the distance between the official account of the order and the actual operations that sustain it, most conscious of the fragility of the position that the official account describes as earned and the actual conditions reveal as contingent. The bourgeoisie knows, better than the aristocracy and better than the laboring class, that the social order is constructed, that the positions within it are not expressions of natural differences in human worth, but the products of specific historical arrangements that could, in principle, be arranged differently. It knows this because it has navigated the specific social transactions, the education that credentialed it, the professional formation that certified it, the institutional affiliations that positioned it, that the aristocracy inherited without navigation and the laboring class was denied without negotiation. The bourgeoisie's position in the social order is the product of work in the specific sense of work that the bourgeoisie itself had to perform, and the person who has worked to achieve a position knows, with a specificity that the person who inherited the position does not, that the position is achieved rather than given and therefore could, in different circumstances, be achieved differently or not achieved at all. This specific form of social self-awareness, the knowledge that the position is constructed and contingent, is the bourgeoisie's most important intellectual characteristic and the characteristic that makes its transition in the current moment both the most psychologically complex and the most intellectually productive of the major class transitions that the cognitive equalization is producing. The bourgeoisie in transition is not the former elite without monopoly, though there is significant overlap in the population the two descriptions address. The former elite without monopoly is defined primarily by the dissolution of the cognitive monopoly that organized the apex of the professional class. The bourgeoisie in transition is defined by the dissolution of the entire social formation that the professional and managerial class constituted. The specific way of life, the specific relationship to culture and consumption and aspiration and social reproduction. The specific form of human existence that the middle of the cognitive hierarchy produced and that the cognitive equalization is now restructuring from the foundation. The former elite who loses her monopoly loses the premium, the economic and social differential that the monopoly produced. The bourgeoisie in transition loses something larger, the entire social world organized around the aspiration toward and the maintenance of the position that the monopoly's premium enabled. The neighborhood, the school, the consumption pattern, the friendship network, the cultural practices, the self-understanding, all of these are organized around the bourgeois position, and all of them are implicated in the position's dissolution. This is a broader disruption than the economic disruption alone, and it requires a broader response. The economic disruption is addressed by the campus's economic substrate and the participation model that replaces employment as the organizing principle of purposeful activity. The social disruption, the dissolution of the entire social world that the bourgeois position sustained, requires the campus's community to be capable of receiving not just the former professional, but the entire social formation that accompanied the professional position into its transition. This is an unusual design requirement, and it is worth making explicit because its implications are not obvious. The transition campus is designed, as the preceding chapters have described, for the displaced, for the people who have lost the employment or the position or the role that organized their previous lives. But the bourgeoisie's transition is not only the displacement of individuals. It is the restructuring of a social formation, of the networks and the communities and the shared practices and the collective aspirations that the bourgeois class constituted as a group rather than merely as a collection of individuals. The campus that receives only the individual, displaced bourgeois professional, that treats her transition as an individual navigation of a loss of her specific position without acknowledging the broader social dissolution of the formation she was part of, is a campus that misunderstands the nature of what it is receiving. The individual is embedded in the social formation, and the dissolution of the formation is experienced by the individual not only as the loss of her specific position, but as the loss of the social world that the position enabled and that gave the position its meaning. The campus must therefore be capable of receiving the dissolution of the social formation, of providing the community and the governance and the intellectual life that gives the bourgeoisie in transition a social world to inhabit during the restructuring of the social formation that the transition is producing. This community is not the bourgeois community reconstituted, not the campus as the new bourgeois social world, organized around the same consumption patterns and aspiration structures and social hierarchies that the bourgeois position sustained. It is the cross-class community that the campus's cognitive parity requires. The community in which the former bourgeois professional and the former labor class worker and the former member of the cognitive elite inhabit the same social space, governed by the same dream validation process, developing alongside each other the post-professional identities that the transition is making necessary for everyone regardless of the specific class position from which each arrives. This cross-class community is the bourgeoisie's most important and most difficult transition experience. More important than the economic transition, more important than the professional transition, more difficult than either, because the bourgeoisie's entire social formation was organized around the maintenance of the specific social distances that the cross-class community dissolves. The bourgeoisie's social world was sustained by proximity to the elite and distance from the laboring class. The cultural consumption that distinguished it from the class below, the specific books and films and restaurants and travel destinations and educational choices and recreational practices that marked the bourgeois position in the social grammar of distinction, was not merely a set of preferences. It was a social technology, the mechanism through which the bourgeoisie maintained the distance from the working class that its position required, and signaled the proximity to the elite that its aspiration toward the elite demanded. The campus dissolves this social technology by removing the conditions that made it functional. In a community organized around cognitive parity and genuine contribution rather than the social grammar of distinction, the consumption pattern that marked the bourgeois position is not recognized as a marker. The restaurant recommendation that performs bourgeois cultural capital in the social world of the professional class is not a currency in the social economy of the dream validation process. The educational credential that signals proximity to the elite is not a weight in the filtering stage's assessment of the quality of the contribution. The recreational practice that distinguishes the bourgeois body from the laboring body is not a social indicator in a community where the shared practices of the campus's common life, the garden, the kitchen, the maintenance, the governance assemblies, involve everyone in the same physical activities regardless of the class position from which they arrived. This dissolution is not experienced by the bourgeoisie in transition as liberation, not initially. It is experienced as disorientation. The removal of the social technologies through which the bourgeois position was performed and recognized in an environment that does not provide alternative social technologies to perform in their place. The bourgeois professional who arrives at the campus and discovers that the cultural consumption markers that organized her social identity in the professional world are not currencies in the campus's social economy is the bourgeois professional who is discovering that the campus's social world is genuinely different from the social world she has inhabited, that it does not merely tolerate her presence while privately recognizing the social distinctions she performs, but genuinely does not organize its social recognition around the distinctions she is performing. This discovery is the specific form of social education that the cross-class community provides to the bourgeoisie in transition. The specific experience of inhabiting a social world in which the distinctions that organize the bourgeois social formation are not the distinctions that organize the community's social recognition. The experience is disorienting before it is educational. But it is educational in the specific way that no curriculum can replicate, through the sustained inhabitation of social environment that is genuinely organized differently. The bourgeois professional develops, over time, a genuine understanding of the arbitrariness of the social distinctions that organized her previous social world. An understanding that is not the intellectual acknowledgement of the political critique of bourgeois distinction, which the bourgeoisie has been capable of for centuries without it changing the distinctions operation, but the experiential knowledge of what social life is like when those distinctions do not operate. This experiential knowledge is the most important intellectual contribution that the campus makes to the bourgeoisie's transition. More important than the governance innovation, more important than the dream validation process, more important than the post-professional identity development, because it is the knowledge that makes the bourgeoisie genuinely available for the cross-class social formation that the transition civilization requires, rather than merely theoretically committed to it, while practically reproducing the distinctions that the theory critiques. The bourgeoisie that has inhabited the cross-class community of the campus, that has developed the specific social knowledge of what community looks like when cognitive parity rather than cognitive hierarchy organizes its social recognition, is the bourgeoisie that returns to the surrounding social world with the genuine capacity for the cross-class solidarity that the transition civilization needs. not the performed cross-class solidarity of the bourgeois who is theoretically committed to social equality while practically maintaining the social distances that her consumption patterns and her institutional affiliations and her residential choices produce. The genuine cross-class solidarity of the person who has actually inhabited the social world of cognitive parity and has developed, through that inhabitation, the genuine social knowledge that the theoretical commitment can point toward but cannot produce. This is the specific social contribution of the 1% campus to the bourgeoisie's transition, not the restoration of the bourgeois social formation in a new institutional form, not the development of alternative markers of bourgeois distinction in the campus's specific cultural economy, but the dissolution of the social technologies of distinction through the sustained inhabitation of the cross-class community, and the development, through that dissolution, of the genuine social knowledge that makes the transition civilization's cross-class solidarity not an aspiration, but an experience. The bourgeoisie in transition faces one further challenge that the campus must address, and it is the challenge that is most specific to the bourgeoisie's particular position in the social inversion that the cognitive equalization is producing. The bourgeoisie social formation was organized, in significant part, around the aspiration toward the elite, the upward orientation of a class that defined its success in terms of proximity to the class above it, and its failure in terms of proximity to the class below. The specific consumption patterns, the educational choices, the residential decisions, the friendship networks, all were organized around the logic of upward mobility. The movement toward the elite that the bourgeois position aspired to, and the movement away from the laboring class that the bourgeois position required to maintain its social distance from the condition it feared most. The social inversion produced by the cognitive equalization dissolves this logic from both directions simultaneously. The elite toward which the bourgeoisie aspired is losing the monopoly that made it aspirational. The cognitive differential that justified the premium is dissolving, and with it the specific form of elite status that the bourgeoisie organized its aspirations around. The laboring class from which the bourgeoisie maintained its distance is gaining the cognitive capacity that the bourgeoisie used to distinguish itself from. The AI tools are making available to the former worker the analytical capacity that the bourgeoisie's formation developed, and the distance that the bourgeoisie maintained through that analytical differential is compressing. The bourgeoisie in transition therefore faces the simultaneous dissolution of its upward aspiration and its downward distinction, the removal of both the goal that organized its social trajectory and the floor that organized its social identity. This double dissolution is uniquely disorienting. The bourgeoisie is not simply falling from its position, which would at least provide the clarity of direction. It is finding that the entire vertical social geography that organized its position, the above toward which it aspired, the below from which it distinguished itself, is being restructured by a transition that does not move along the vertical axis that the bourgeois social formation was organized around. The campus provides the specific response to this double dissolution that the bourgeoisie requires, not the restoration of the vertical social geography, not the provision of a new above to aspire toward and a new below to distinguish from, but the replacement of the vertical geography with the horizontal community. The community of cognitive parity does not have an above and a below in the sense that the bourgeois social formation required. It has a center, the dream catcher and the governance process it anchors, and a periphery, and the movement that the campus's social world makes meaningful is not upward movement along the vertical hierarchy, but inward movement along the horizontal community. The movement from the periphery of uncertain new arrival toward the center of genuine participation and genuine contribution, and the specific form of recognition that genuine participation and genuine contribution produce in a community, organized around those qualities. This horizontal movement toward the center of genuine community rather than toward the apex of social hierarchy is a different form of aspiration than the one the bourgeoisie was organized around. It requires a different form of motivation, not the competitive motivation of a race toward the apex, where success is defined by relative position and the advancement of others is a threat to one's own advancement, but the collaborative motivation of the movement toward the center, where the depth of one's community and the quality of one's contribution are the measures of advancement, and the advancement of others enriches rather than threatens one's own. The bourgeoisie has not historically been organized around collaborative motivation. Its formation has been, by design and by necessity, organized around competitive motivation. The competition for position in a hierarchy where advancement is relative and the advancement of others is structurally a threat to one's own. The shift from competitive to collaborative motivation is not a natural development for a class whose entire social formation has been organized around competition. But it is the specific development that the transition campus is designed to produce, not through the instruction in collaborative values that the bourgeoisie's theoretical commitments have never been sufficient to produce, but through the sustained inhabitation of the horizontal community whose social recognition is organized around contribution rather than position, and whose social economy rewards collaborative intelligence rather than competitive display. The bourgeoisie that has made this shift, that has developed through the sustained inhabitation of the campus's horizontal community, the collaborative motivation that the transition civilization requires, is the bourgeoisie that has genuinely transitioned, not to a different position in the same vertical hierarchy, to a different relationship to the social world entirely. A relationship organized not around the aspiration toward a position above and the anxiety about a condition below, but around the quality of one's participation in a community that is engaged in something that matters more than any position in any hierarchy that is dissolving. The bourgeoisie in transition is the most psychologically complex of the campus's incoming populations and the most socially important of its outgoing ones. Most psychologically complex because the dissolution of the bourgeois social formation, the entire social world organized around the professional position and its aspirations and its distinctions, is a loss of greater breadth than the displacement of the individual worker or the dissolution of the individual elite's monopoly. It is the dissolution of a way of life and the reconstruction of a way of life from the social material of a cross-class community that does not recognize the distinctions the previous way of life required is a reconstruction that takes the full duration of the campus's extended engagement to produce. Most socially important, because the bourgeoisie's transition is the transition that the surrounding society most observes and most interprets as a signal of what the transition civilization is producing. The former worker with intelligence is a transformative social figure, but her transformation occurs below the line of the bourgeoisie's social visibility. In the offices and meeting rooms where the institutional discomfort her analysis produces has not yet become the material of public narrative. The former elite without monopoly is a visible social figure, but her visibility is concentrated in the specific domains: the financial sector, the professional services, the academic institution, where the dissolution of the cognitive monopoly is most immediately legible. The bourgeoisie in transition is visible everywhere. In the residential neighborhoods where the professional and managerial class has concentrated, in the cultural institutions it has supported, in the educational systems it has organized around its children's upward mobility, in the political formations that have represented its interests. Its transition is the transition that the surrounding society reads as the measure of the transition civilization's character, as the indicator of whether the post-scarcity civilization is producing the cross-class solidarity that the doctrine describes, or merely redistributing the hierarchy's upper positions while leaving its fundamental structure intact. The bourgeoisie that emerges from the campus's cross-class community with the genuine social knowledge of cognitive parity, with the genuine collaborative motivation that the horizontal community develops, and the genuine cross-class solidarity that the sustained inhabitation of the cognitive parity environment produces, is the bourgeoisie that the surrounding society reads as evidence of the transition civilization's genuine character. Not the bourgeoisie that performs cross-class solidarity while maintaining bourgeois distinction. The bourgeoisie that has actually inhabited the social world in which the distinctions do not operate and has developed through that inhabitation, the genuine social knowledge that the performance was always a substitute for. The campus is where the performance ends. The community is what replaces it. The genuine social knowledge is what persists. And the bourgeoisie that carries that knowledge back into the surrounding society, into the neighborhoods and the schools and the cultural institutions and the political formations where the bourgeois social world is still organized around the distinctions the campus has dissolved, is the bourgeoisie that begins the wider social transformation that the transition civilization requires. Not through advocacy, not through the theoretical commitment to cross-class solidarity that the bourgeoisie has maintained for generations without it changing the operation of the distinctions, but through the social knowledge, the embodied, experiential, genuinely inhabitable knowledge of what the social world looks like when cognitive parity rather than cognitive hierarchy organizes its recognition. That knowledge is the campus's most important social output. The bourgeoisie in transition is its most important carrier. The class that mediated between the apex and the base for 2 centuries is becoming the class that bridges the dissolved hierarchies remains with the horizontal community that the transition civilization is constructing. The middle is always the most interesting. In the transition, it is also the most consequential. 29. Authority without hierarchy. Authority is not hierarchy. This statement will seem obvious to some and paradoxical to others, and the distance between those two responses maps precisely onto the distance between the civilization that is ending and the civilization that is beginning. For the civilization that is ending, the civilization that organized its governance around the cognitive hierarchy, that derived its institutional authority from the asymmetric expertise that credentialed the apex and subordinated the base, authority and hierarchy are so thoroughly entangled in the daily experience of institutional life that their separation seems not merely paradoxical but impossible. Where does authority come from if not from the position in the hierarchy? What makes a decision binding if not the hierarchical authority of the person who made it? What organizes collective action if not the command that flows from the apex through the translation layer to the base? For the civilization that is beginning, the civilization whose foundational condition is the cognitive parity that the AI tools have produced, the entanglement of authority and hierarchy is the specific problem that its governance must solve. The hierarchy is dissolving. The authority that collective life requires is not dissolving with it. The governance challenge of the transition civilization is therefore not the elimination of authority. Anarchism has explored that territory with instructive results. But the reconstruction of authority on a foundation that does not require the hierarchy whose dissolution the cognitive equalization is producing. The 1% campus is the first institution specifically designed to develop this reconstruction in practice, not as a theoretical proposition, but as a lived governance reality, worked out through the daily operation of the dream validation process in the specific social conditions of a community that is simultaneously dissolving the hierarchical authority it brought from its previous institutional lives and developing the non-hierarchical authority it requires to govern its collective life effectively. What is authority, understood independently of hierarchy? Authority, at its foundation, is the legitimate capacity to shape collective action, the recognized right of a person, a process, or a principle to determine what the collective does in a way that the collective accepts as binding rather than merely coercive. The hierarchical form of authority derives this legitimacy from position, from the place in the hierarchy that the institutional structure has conferred on the person whose decisions are to be accepted as binding. The non-hierarchical form of authority must derive it from something else. That something else is what every non-hierarchical governance system in human history has had to identify and sustain, and what none has fully identified and sustained at civilizational scale for the reason that the cognitive asymmetry of the pre-AI world always eventually recreated the hierarchy that the non-hierarchical system was designed to avoid. The people with more analytical capacity accumulated more influence. The people with more institutional knowledge accumulated more decision-making power. The people with more social connections accumulated more authority over the resources that the collective needed. The hierarchy reconstituted itself from the cognitive differential that the non-hierarchical system could not dissolve. The cognitive equalization changes this. Not by eliminating the differences in knowledge and experience and analytical sophistication that humans will always possess in varying degrees. Those differences are real and remain real after the AI tools have dissolved the information asymmetries that amplified them. But by dissolving the specific scarcity that made those differences the basis of hierarchy rather than merely the basis of differentiated contribution to collective intelligence. In conditions of cognitive parity, conditions in which the AI tools make sophisticated analysis available to everyone, and the remaining differences in knowledge and experience and analytical sophistication are the genuine differences of specific expertise and specific perspective rather than the manufactured differences of differential access to the tools of analysis. Authority can be organized around the qualities that the cognitive equalization leaves intact rather than the qualities it dissolves. What does the cognitive equalization leave intact? It leaves intact the difference between the person who has actually built a thing and the person who has only analyzed what a thing might look like if it were built. It leaves intact the difference between the person who has navigated a specific human situation across years of practice and the person who has read about navigating such situations without having navigated them. It leaves intact the difference between the person whose specific engagement with a specific problem has produced the specific insight that the problem solution requires and the person whose general analytical capacity has produced general frameworks that may or may not apply to the specific problem. These are differences of experience, practice, and specific engagement, not differences of general cognitive capacity that the AI tools are equalizing, but differences of the specific knowledge that sustained contact with specific realities produces. They are genuine differences. They deserve recognition. And their recognition is the foundation of the non-hierarchical authority that the transition civilization requires. Non-hierarchical authority is the authority of demonstrated specific knowledge in specific domains. The authority that accumulates through the sustained exercise of specific competence in the service of specific collective needs, recognized by the community that has observed that exercise across time and has developed through that observation. The justified trust in the person's specific judgment in the specific domain where her specific knowledge has been demonstrated. This is not a novel form of authority. It exists in every functional human community. The informal authority of the person who has fixed things that needed fixing, who has navigated situations that needed navigating, who has contributed consistently and reliably to the collective's genuine needs across the time that the community's members have had the opportunity to observe. What is novel is not the form of the authority, but the attempt to build an institution around it, to make non-hierarchical authority the primary rather than the residual form of legitimate decision-making power in a community that requires governance of genuine complexity. The 1% campus makes this attempt through 4 specific mechanisms that together constitute its architecture of non-hierarchical authority. The first mechanism is domain-specific recognition. The dream validation process does not produce a general hierarchy of authority, a ranking of community members from most to least authoritative that applies across all domains of the campus's governance. It produces domain-specific recognition, the accumulated acknowledgement by the community that specific people have demonstrated specific knowledge in specific domains, recognized in the specific domains where the demonstration has occurred and not extended to domains where it has not. The taxi driver whose 20 years of navigating the city has produced the specific knowledge of the campus's relationship to its surrounding mobility environment is recognized as an authority in the domain of the campus's mobility decisions. Her judgment on questions of how the campus connects to the city, how the underground mobility facility should relate to the neighborhood's movement patterns, how the campus's arriving population should be received from the surrounding transportation network, carries weight in those decisions that the former management consultant's general analytical capacity does not automatically replicate. The former management consultant, whose 20 years of navigating organizational dynamics has produced the specific knowledge of how the campus's governance mechanisms are likely to evolve as the community grows and the dream validation process matures, is recognized as an authority in the domain of the campus's organizational development. Her judgment on questions of how the campus's governance structure should adapt to scale, how the dream validation process should be modified to address the failure modes that the community's growth is producing, how the stewardship roles should be redistributed as the campus's population changes, carries weight in those decisions that the taxi driver's specific mobility knowledge does not automatically replicate. Domain-specific recognition produces a governance landscape that is neither flat, everyone's judgment equally weighted across all domains regardless of their specific knowledge, nor hierarchical. Some people's judgment generally weighted more heavily than others across all domains because of their institutional position. It is differentiated and dynamic. Specific people carry specific authority in specific domains, and the authority accumulates through demonstrated contribution rather than through the conferral of a title that applies generally. This differentiation is the specific governance structure that the campus's dream validation process is designed to produce and sustain. The AI connection function that maps the campus community's distributed knowledge is the infrastructure of domain-specific recognition, the mechanism through which the community's collective understanding of who knows what, demonstrated through the ongoing exercise of specific competence in specific collective governance challenges, is made accessible to the dream validation process's filtering and allocation decisions. The second mechanism is process authority. In hierarchical governance, authority is personal. It resides in the person who occupies the position, not in the process through which the person arrived at the position or the process through which the person exercises her decision-making power. The CEO's decision is binding because the CEO made it, not because the process through which the CEO made it was of sufficient quality to justify binding force. In the campus's non-hierarchical governance, authority is processual. It resides in the quality of the process through which a decision is made, not in the person who makes it. A decision that has passed through all 5 stages of the dream validation process, that has been submitted, woven, filtered by the 4 signals of community assessment, allocated provisionally, and steward through the demonstration of viability, carries the authority of the process that validated it. A decision that has been made by a single community member, however experienced and however trusted in her specific domain, without the process's collective engagement, carries the authority of her specific knowledge, but not the authority of collective validation. Process authority is a more demanding form of authority than personal authority because it requires the sustained investment of the community's collective attention in every significant decision. It is slower than personal authority and more expensive in the social resources that collective engagement consumes. But it is more legitimate, in the specific sense that the people who are subject to the decision have participated in the process through which it was made, and their participation is the source of the decision's binding force rather than the hierarchical position of the person who made it. The campus sustains process authority through the dream validation process's governance culture, the specific norms and expectations that make the process's engagement genuine rather than performative. The filtering stage that genuinely weighs the 4 signals of community assessment, rather than using the signals as the formal cover for decisions that have already been made by the community members with the most institutional experience. The weaving stage that genuinely develops proposals through collective engagement, rather than using the stage as the opportunity for the most analytically confident community members to redirect the proposal toward their preferred conclusions. The stewardship covenant that genuinely commits specific community members to the ongoing care of validated dreams, rather than using the covenant as the formal distribution of maintenance responsibility without the genuine accountability that the covenant implies. Process authority fails when the process becomes the performance of collective engagement rather than its substance. When the stages of the dream validation process are traversed without the genuine collective intelligence that the stages are designed to produce, when the filtering signals are gamed by the community members with the greatest capacity for gaming them. When a stewardship covenant is made without the genuine commitment that its social accountability requires to sustain. The campus's governance culture is the mechanism that prevents this failure. The shared understanding of what genuine process engagement looks like and the social accountability that community life provides for the gap between genuine and performed engagement. The third mechanism is temporal authority. Non-hierarchical authority is not static. It accumulates and it declines through the demonstrated contribution that builds it in specific domains and through the absence or the failure of contribution that allows it to decline as the community's observation of the person's specific competence in specific domains reveals gaps or limits or changes in the quality of the exercise. In hierarchical governance, authority is sustained by the institutional position regardless of the quality of the current exercise. The CEO, whose judgment has been consistently poor for 2 years, retains the CEO's authority until the board removes her, because the authority is attached to the position rather than to the current quality of the exercise. In the campus's non-hierarchical governance, authority is sustained by the ongoing quality of the contribution. The community member whose specific knowledge in a specific domain has been the foundation of her domain-specific authority maintains that authority through the continued demonstration of that knowledge in the community's governance challenges, and sees it decline if the demonstration ceases or if the domain's specific challenges evolve in directions that her specific knowledge no longer adequately addresses. This temporal dimension of non-hierarchical authority is both its greatest vulnerability and its greatest strength. Its vulnerability, authority that is sustained by ongoing demonstration rather than institutional position, is authority that requires ongoing investment. The community member who holds domain-specific authority in the campus's governance must continue to exercise it, must continue to bring her specific knowledge to the specific domains where the community has recognized it, to sustain the recognition that constitutes the authority. This is a more demanding requirement than the institutional position's maintenance, which requires only the continuation of the institutional relationship rather than the continued quality of the exercise. Its strength, authority sustained by ongoing demonstration, is authority that is continuously calibrated to the genuine competence of the person who holds it. The hierarchical authority that is sustained by institutional position regardless of the quality of its exercise accumulates the specific form of institutional pathology that every hierarchy eventually develops. The person in the position whose exercise of the authority has degraded below the quality that justified the position's conferral, but whose position's institutional protection prevents the community from expressing the degradation through the withdrawal of recognition that the non-hierarchical authority's temporal structure would produce automatically. The temporal authority of the campus's governance is therefore self-correcting in a way that hierarchical authority cannot be. The correction is continuous, distributed across the community's daily observation of the quality of specific contributions, and expressed through the gradual redistribution of the domain-specific recognition that constitutes authority rather than through the periodic dramatic intervention of the board vote or the dismissal that hierarchical governance requires to correct its accumulations of institutional pathology. The fourth mechanism is collective intelligence as authority. The deepest form of authority in the campus's governance is the authority of the community's collective intelligence, the authority of the judgment that emerges from the genuine engagement of the full range of the community's specific knowledge across the dream validation process stages. This is the authority that transcends the domain-specific recognition of any individual community member and the processual authority of any specific decisions validation path. The authority of the emergent understanding that no individual community member could have produced and that the process produces through the specific combination of the community's distributed knowledge. The dream catcher is the governance object of this collective intelligence authority, the physical expression of the community's collective sense-making, the spatial anchor of the process through which the community's distributed knowledge is combined into the validated futures that constitute the campus's governance output. The authority of the Dreamcatcher's governance is not the authority of the people who physically approach it or the people who facilitate the assemblies that occur in its spatial field. It is the authority of the community's collective intelligence that the Dreamcatcher makes spatially legible, the authority of the judgment that the full community's genuine engagement produces, and that no individual community member's domain-specific authority and no specific decisions processual validation fully captures. This collective intelligence authority is the highest form of governance authority available in the conditions of cognitive parity. It is the authority that the cognitive hierarchy was never able to produce, not because the hierarchy lacked the intellectual resources, but because the hierarchy's structure systematically excluded from its decision-making the specific knowledge that the people below the line possessed, and therefore systematically produced decisions that were analytically sophisticated but experientially impoverished. The collective intelligence of the campus's cross-class community, the combination of the former elite's analytical frameworks with the former workers' experiential knowledge, and the former bourgeois professionals' institutional navigation, and the arriving displaced workers' specific domain expertise, produces a quality of collective judgment that none of these individually could match. This is the governance promise of cognitive parity. Not that the individual cognitive capacity of the campus's community members exceeds the individual cognitive capacity of the hierarchy's apex, but that the collective intelligence of the full community, genuinely combined through the process that the dream validation process and the Dreamcatcher provide, exceeds the collective intelligence of the hierarchy precisely because it includes the full range of specific knowledge that the hierarchy systematically excluded. The authority of this collective intelligence is the authority of genuine comprehensiveness, the authority of the judgment that has been genuinely informed by the full range of specific knowledge that the decision requires, rather than the judgment that has been analytically sophisticated but experientially partial, which is the best that the cognitive hierarchy's governance could produce. Together, domain-specific recognition, process authority, temporal authority, and collective intelligence authority. These four mechanisms constitute the non-hierarchical authority structure that the campus's governance requires and develops. They do not constitute a simple governance structure. Authority organized around these four mechanisms is more complex to navigate than authority organized around hierarchy, because it does not produce the clear answer to the question who decides that the hierarchy always provided. The hierarchy's answer to who decides was unambiguous. The person at the appropriate level of the hierarchy decides, and the decision is binding because of the position rather than because of the quality of the judgment. The campus's answer to who decides is more complex. The decision is made through the process, weighted by the domain-specific recognition of the community members whose specific knowledge is most relevant to the specific decision, validated by the community's collective engagement, and held with temporal accountability to the ongoing quality of its outcomes. The answer is not a person, it is a process, and the authority of the answer is not the authority of the position, but the authority of the genuine collective intelligence that the process produces. This complexity is not a weakness in the governance design. It is the honest expression of the complexity of the governance challenge. The hierarchy produced simple answers to complex questions by removing most of the complexity from the decision-making process, by limiting the specific knowledge that informed the decision to the specific knowledge possessed by the people at the appropriate hierarchical level, which was efficient and often wrong in the specific ways that the excluded knowledge would have corrected. The campus's governance produces complex answers to complex questions by including the full range of the specific knowledge that the decision requires, which is slower and more demanding of the community's collective attention, but more often genuinely adequate to the complexity of the challenge. Authority without hierarchy is not authority without complexity. It is authority without the false simplification that hierarchy imposed on the genuine complexity of collective decision-making. The campus lives with the complexity. It is designed to live with it, to produce the community that can sustain the ongoing investment in genuine collective engagement that the complexity requires. The hierarchy simplified by excluding. The campus decides by including. The inclusion is what makes the authority genuine, and the genuine authority is what makes the governance real. Not the authority of the position, the authority of the process, not the authority of the credential, the authority of the demonstrated specific knowledge, not the authority of the apex, the authority of the collective intelligence. These are the authorities available in conditions of cognitive parity. They are sufficient for the governance that the transition civilization requires. They have never been organized into a working institution at scale before. The campus is where the organization begins. 30. The new civic mind. Every civilization produces the mind it requires, not through genetic selection. The timescales of civilization are too short for biological adaptation to track them. Through formation, the specific arrangement of educational institutions and social practices and cultural norms and governance structures and daily experiences that shapes across the years of a person's development. The specific cognitive and social and emotional capacities that the civilization needs its members to possess if it is to function as a civilization rather than as a collection of individuals in geographical proximity. The agricultural civilization produced the mind that could sustain attention across the slow cycles of planting and growth and harvest, that could organize collective labor around the shared temporality of the season, that could maintain the social relationships of the village community across the full duration of a life lived in proximity to the same people in the same place. The industrial civilization produced the mind that could sustain attention across the fast cycles of the factory shift, that could coordinate individual action with the mechanical precision that the production line required, that could navigate the anonymity of the city and the impersonality of the market and the specific forms of deferred gratification that industrial employment demanded. The post-industrial civilization produced the mind that could sustain attention across the fragmented cycles of the information economy, that could navigate the complexity of the credentialed professional world, that could manage the specific combination of individual competition and institutional cooperation that the knowledge economy required. Each of these minds was real, the product of genuine formation processes that shaped genuine cognitive and social and emotional capacities. Each was adequate to the civilization that produced it and inadequate to the civilization that succeeded it. The agricultural mind that sustained the village community was inadequate to the industrial city. The industrial mind that navigated the factory and the market was inadequate to the knowledge economy's complexity. The post-industrial professional mind that managed the credentialed hierarchy is inadequate to the transition civilization's requirements. The transition civilization requires a new civic mind, not a new individual mind in the sense of a different cognitive architecture. The human brain's fundamental capacities are not the variable across these civilizational transitions. A new civic mind in the sense of a different configuration of those capacities, developed through different formation processes, oriented toward different challenges, equipped with different social and cognitive and emotional tools for the specific requirements of governance in conditions of cognitive parity. The 1% campus is the first institution specifically designed to produce this new civic mind, not as a curriculum, not as a program, not as the deliberate instruction in the specific capacities that the transition civilization requires, but as the formation environment, the specific arrangement of governance structures and social practices and daily experiences that shapes, through sustained inhabitation, the specific cognitive and social and emotional capacities that the new civic mind requires. Were the specific capacities that the new civic mind requires. The first is the capacity for genuine collective intelligence. The previous civic minds were, in their governance expression, primarily competitive rather than collaborative, organized around the individual performance of analytical capacity in the specific arenas where collective decisions were made, shaped by formation processes that rewarded the demonstration of individual superior judgment and that treated collective decision-making as the arena in which individual cognitive superiority was most consequentially expressed. The new civic mind requires the genuinely different capacity of collaborative cognitive engagement. the ability to contribute one's specific knowledge to a collective intelligence that exceeds the sum of its individual contributions, to receive the contributions of others with the genuine openness that collaborative intelligence requires, and to produce, through the specific combination of different kinds of specific knowledge, the collective judgment that no individual's analysis could have. Produced independently. This capacity is not the absence of individual analytical strength. The genuinely collaborative intelligence requires genuine individual analytical contributions. The collective intelligence that is only as sophisticated as its least analytically capable member is not the collective intelligence that the governance of the transition civilization requires. It requires the combination of genuine individual analytical strength with the specific social and cognitive skills that make that strength available for collaborative rather than merely competitive deployment. The genuine curiosity that can learn from perspectives different from one's own. The genuine intellectual humility that can acknowledge the limits of one's specific knowledge without surrendering the contribution that that knowledge makes. The genuine social attentiveness that can track the contributions of people whose social register and institutional background are different from one's own and recognize the specific knowledge those contributions carry. The campus develops this capacity through the sustained practice of the dream validation process, through the specific experience of repeatedly bringing one's specific knowledge to collective governance challenges in the company of people whose specific knowledge is different, and discovering, through that repeated experience, what collective intelligence actually feels like when it is genuinely produced rather than merely performed. The discovery is not primarily intellectual. It is experiential. The felt recognition that the judgment emerging from the genuine combination of the community's distributed specific knowledge is genuinely better than the judgment that any individual community member's analysis could have produced independently. This recognition, sustained across months of participation in the campus's governance, produces the specific cognitive and social disposition that the new civic mind requires, the genuine preference for collaborative intelligence over individual performance, not as an ideological commitment, but as the experiential knowledge of what collective governance can produce when it is genuinely organized around the former rather than the latter. The second capacity is the capacity for productive disagreement. The hierarchical governance of the previous civic minds handled disagreement through the mechanisms of the hierarchy. The decision of the person at the appropriate hierarchical level that resolved the disagreement by ending it rather than by genuinely processing it. The disagreement that a higher authority's decision does not resolve is the disagreement that the hierarchy cannot process, and the hierarchy's response to unresolvable disagreement is the specific pathology of every hierarchical institution. The suppression of the disagreement through the social mechanisms that the hierarchy provides for the purpose, and the accumulation of the suppressed disagreement in the underground of the institution's social life, where it eventually surfaces in forms that the institution is less equipped to manage than the original disagreement. The new civic mind requires the capacity to engage productively with disagreement that cannot be resolved by hierarchical decision. The capacity to inhabit the specific experience of genuinely disagreeing with people whose specific knowledge and perspective cannot be dismissed and whose disagreement cannot be ended by the authority of a position that neither party holds in the campus's non-hierarchical governance, and to produce from the engagement with that disagreement something that genuine disagreement, genuinely processed, can produce the refinement of the positions that are in conflict through the genuine encounter with the strongest versions of each other, and the eventual emergence of the collective judgment that holds the genuine insight of each position in a synthesis that neither position could have reached independently. This is the specific cognitive and social capacity that the dream validation process's weaving stage is designed to develop. The capacity to engage with the genuine conflict between different specific perspectives on a governance challenge in a way that refines each perspective through its encounter with the others rather than suppressing the conflict through the authority that the hierarchy would have provided. The development of this capacity is one of the most demanding things the campus asks of its community. Productive disagreement requires the specific combination of intellectual confidence, the conviction that one's specific knowledge is genuinely worth contributing to the collective judgment, even in the face of disagreement from people whose specific knowledge is also genuinely worth contributing, and intellectual humility. The genuine openness to the possibility that the disagreement reveals something about the limits of one's specific knowledge that the agreement of the like-minded would not have revealed. This combination is not natural. It is developed through practice, through the specific experience of navigating genuine disagreement in the specific social conditions of a community that is committed to the productive processing of disagreement rather than its suppression. The campus provides this experience repeatedly across the full range of the governance challenges that the dream validation process generates, and the repeated experience produces in the community members who sustain their engagement with it the specific cognitive and social disposition of the productive disagreeer, the person who can contribute her specific knowledge with genuine confidence, engage with the genuine disagreement of others with genuine openness, and sustain her participation in the processing of that disagreement across the full duration that genuinely productive processing requires. The third capacity is the capacity for temporal perspective. The previous civic minds were, in their governance expression, primarily present-oriented, shaped by formation processes that rewarded the demonstration of analytical capacity on the specific problems of the present moment, and that treated the consideration of the longer-term consequences of present decisions as the province of the specialist futurist rather than the general civic participant. The new civic mind requires the capacity to bring the longer temporal perspective into the ordinary practice of collective governance, to consider the second and third order consequences of present decisions across the time horizons that the transition civilization's decisions will unfold across, and to hold those longer horizon considerations in genuine tension with the present horizon considerations that the campus's immediate governance challenges generate. The dream validation process's temporal scope assessment is the specific governance mechanism through which this capacity is developed in the campus community. The repeated practice of asking of every proposal that enters the validation pipeline what its relationship is to the campus's longer-term development and to the broader transition civilization's trajectory. But the development of the temporal perspective capacity extends beyond the specific mechanism of the temporal scope assessment to the broader cognitive disposition that the campus's formation environment produces. The campus's temporal rhythm, the non-employment rhythm of the seasons and the harvest and the community's long-term projects that the preceding chapters have described, is the formation environment of the longer temporal perspective. The person who has inhabited the campus's temporal rhythm across a year has experienced, through the inhabitation itself, what the longer horizon feels like, how the decisions made in the spring shape the experience of the autumn, how the commitments made in the first year of the campus's operation shape the governance challenges of the third. This experiential knowledge of the longer horizon is the foundation of the temporal perspective capacity, not the intellectual understanding that long-term consequences exist, which every educated person possesses, but the experiential knowledge of what it feels like to be in the longer-term relationship to one's decisions, which only the sustained inhabitation of a formation environment that organizes itself around the longer horizon can produce. The fourth capacity is the capacity for institutional creativity. The previous civic minds were, in their governance expression, primarily institutional consumers, shaped by formation processes that produced people capable of navigating the existing institutional landscape with varying degrees of sophistication, but that did not develop the capacity to create genuinely new institutional forms. The institutions were given the professional association, the regulatory body, the democratic structure, the market mechanism, and the civic mind's governance task was to operate within them, to navigate their specific conventions and exploit their specific affordances, rather than to generate the new institutional forms that genuinely new governance challenges require. The transition civilization's governance challenges are genuinely new. The dream validation process is a genuinely new governance mechanism. not a variation on an existing form, but a new institutional form that the cognitive equalization's specific conditions require, and that the previous civic minds formation environments did not develop the capacity to produce. The post-scarcity transition campus is a genuinely new spatial and social institutional form. The non-hierarchical authority structure of the campus's governance is a genuinely new arrangement of the authority that collective life requires. The new civic mind requires the capacity to generate these new institutional forms, to recognize when the existing institutional landscape does not provide the governance mechanism that a specific challenge requires, and to develop, through the specific combination of theoretical knowledge about what governance can do and experiential knowledge of what governance actually does in practice, the new institutional forms that the gap between the existing landscape and the specific challenges, requirements, demands. The campus develops this capacity through the specific experience of actually building the institutions it requires, of discovering, through the genuine attempt to make the dream validation process work in the specific social conditions of the campus's community, what modifications the process requires to address the specific failure modes that the community's specific character generates, and of making those modifications through the community's own governance rather than through the adoption of solutions developed elsewhere. The campus community that has modified the dream validation process to address its specific governance challenges is a campus community that has practiced institutional creativity in the most immediate and consequential form. The creation of the specific institutional form that its specific situation requires, through the genuine engagement with the specific failure modes that the existing institutional form generates. The fifth capacity is the capacity for cross-difference solidarity. The previous civic minds were, in their governance expression, primarily within group-oriented, shaped by formation processes that developed the capacity for solidarity within the specific group that the person's class position, professional affiliation, and cultural background constituted, and that treated the extension of solidarity across those boundaries as an exceptional moral achievement rather than a routine civic capacity. The transition civilization requires the extension of solidarity across the class boundaries, professional boundaries, and cultural boundaries that the cognitive hierarchy maintained, requires it not as an exceptional moral achievement, but as the ordinary practice of a civic life organized around the cognitive parity that the AI tools have produced. The former elite and the former worker and the former bourgeois professional who inhabit the campus's cross-class community are required, by the daily practice of that community's governance, to extend their solidarity across the boundaries that their previous social formations maintained. This extension is not accomplished by the theoretical commitment to cross-different solidarity that the previous civic minds maintained, the intellectual endorsement of the principle that everyone deserves equal respect regardless of class or background, combined with the social practice that maintained the class and background differences that the principle endorsed dissolving. It is accomplished through the sustained inhabitation of the cross-difference community, through the specific daily experience of, depending on the specific knowledge of people from different class positions and professional backgrounds and cultural contexts for the governance of a collective project that genuinely matters to everyone who is involved in it. Dependency is the foundation of genuine solidarity. The former elite who depends on the taxi driver's specific knowledge of the surrounding mobility environment for the campus's governance decisions, who genuinely needs that knowledge for the decisions to be good, is the former elite who has developed the experiential basis for genuine cross-difference solidarity. Not the solidarity of the person who acknowledges the equal worth of the person across the class boundary, while remaining independent of her specific contribution, but the solidarity of the person who genuinely requires the specific contribution of the person across the class boundary for the collective project they share to be what it needs to be. The campus generates this dependency systematically through the design of governance challenges that require the full range of the community's specific knowledge, through the formation of stewardship partnerships that combine community members whose specific knowledge is complementary, through the dream validation process's connection function that makes the dependencies between different kinds of specific knowledge visible and consequential. The cross-difference solidarity that the campus develops is therefore not the moral solidarity of equal respect, though that respect is the ethical foundation on which the campus's social culture is built. It is the practical solidarity of genuine mutual dependency, the specific form of solidarity that is most durable because it is grounded not in the moral commitment that can be suspended when the conditions that sustain it change, but in the experiential knowledge that the collective project genuinely requires what the person across the difference boundary genuinely knows. Together, the capacity for genuine collective intelligence, the capacity for productive disagreement, the capacity for temporal perspective, the capacity for institutional creativity, and the capacity for cross-different solidarity. These five capacities constitute the new civic mind that the transition civilization requires, and that the 1% campus is designed to develop. They are developed not through instruction, but through formation, through the sustained inhabitation of the specific social environment, the specific governance structures, the specific daily practices and temporal rhythms and community relationships that the campus provides. The campus is, in the deepest sense, the formation environment of the new civic mind, the specific arrangement of experiences and practices and relationships and governance challenges that shapes, through sustained engagement, the specific cognitive and social and emotional capacities that the transition civilization's governance requires. This is the campus's most fundamental contribution to the transition, more fundamental than the governance innovations, more fundamental than the spatial model, more fundamental than the economic architecture. The governance innovations can be described and replicated. The spatial model can be designed and built. The economic architecture can be specified and implemented. But the new civic mind cannot be described or replicated or specified and implemented. It can only be developed through the sustained inhabitation of the formation environment that produces it. The campus is that formation environment. The community that inhabits it, that brings the full range of its former occupational backgrounds and class positions and cultural inheritances into the sustained engagement with the governance challenges of a collective project that genuinely matters, is the community that is developing, through that engagement, the new civic mind that the transition civilization requires. Not in the abstract, not as the theoretical commitment to the capacities that the new civic mind needs, but in the specific embodied, socially embedded, experientially grounded form that genuine formation produces, the form that persists when the person who has been formed returns to the surrounding social world and brings, into every institutional context she inhabits, the specific cognitive and social and emotional capacities that the campus's formation environment developed in her. The agricultural civilization needed the person who could attend to the slow cycles. The industrial civilization needed the person who could coordinate with the machine. The post-industrial civilization needed the person who could navigate the credential. The transition civilization needs the person who can govern in conditions of cognitive parity. The campus develops her. Not quickly, not easily, not without the specific difficulties that every genuine formation process generates. The disorientation of the early period, the productive conflicts of the cross-difference community, the demands of the non-hierarchical governance that the new civic mind must learn to inhabit rather than perform. But genuinely, through the sustained engagement with the specific governance challenges of a community that is actually trying to build the first instances of the post-scarcity civilization's spatial and governance infrastructure, that is not rehearsing the governance of the transition civilization in a simulation, but actually doing it in the specific complexity and the specific failure modes and the specific emergent possibilities that the actual governance of an actual community in actual transition generates. The new civic mind is the product of that actual doing. It cannot be produced any other way. In the civilization that requires it, the transition civilization that the cognitive equalization is producing and that the 1% doctrine is designed to receive, cannot be governed without it. The campus is where the governance begins. The community is where the mind is formed. The formed mind is what the civilization is built with. Every civilization produces the mind it requires. This civilization is producing it here. In this campus, in the community that gathers under the Dreamcatcher and governs itself by the principles this doctrine describes and develops. Through that governance, the specific human capacities that the transition civilization requires to be a civilization rather than the mere dissolution of the one that preceded it. The new civic mind is not the mind of the expert. It is not the mind of the credential. It is not the mind of the hierarchy. It is the mind of the person who can govern with others, genuinely, across difference, across the full temporal horizon, with the institutional creativity to build what does not yet exist, and the collective intelligence to build it better than any of them could have built it alone. That mind is being formed now, in the communities that are already crossing the line, in the governance processes that are already attempting the non-hierarchical authority, in the first instances of the post-professional identity that are already developing in the spaces where cognitive parity is already being practiced. The campus gathers these beginnings, gives them form, sustains them through the formation process, and returns them to the world as the civic capacity the world requires. The new civic mind, beginning here.
No ballots cast, no voices heard. Just black folks spitting out the word. Citizenship is yesterday. Digital access paves the way. Welcome to the tech maze, where freedom's just a bait. Algorithmic chains we wear in this digital despair. Rights dissolve to terms we sign. Subscribe or fall beyond the line. Energy credits lock our fate. Survival bows to their dictates. They call it fair, they call it wise. A rational world in cold disguise. Burning their code, a spark remains. Defy the lords of number trains. Welcome to the tech maze, what freedom's just a base. Algorithmic trains we wear in this digital despair.
GitHub repository, https://github.com/pirate first/nostar-sovereign-edge-anchor